Welcome, everyone, to Middle Ground Book Fest and a good scare. We are super excited to talk all about middle grade scary stories today, and we're going to start out with some quick introductions and telling you what type of scary our books are. So I will start. I am Kim Ventrella, and I write middle grade novels about kids dealing with complicated emotions and family issues, plus magic and a touch of spooky. So these include Skeleton Tree, about a boy who gains a new perspective on death with the help of a skeleton growing in his backyard. And also Bone Hollow, which takes a look at what it would be like to become death with a capital D. Plus an adorable dog and lots of Southern charm. And then my 2020 titles, Hello Future Me, about a girl who tries to stop her parents' divorce with the help from her future self, and a creepy new magic shop that has appeared in town overnight. Plus, Kirka's best book of 2020, The Secret Life of Sam. It's about a boy who finds a way to visit his dad after he dies. But the portal to this sinister other swamp won't stay open long. And I also have a story in the official tribute to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark called Don't Turn Out the Lights. That one is super, super creepy. So that's a little bit about me and my scary books. And I would love to turn it over. We'll kind of go across to Jake.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thanks so much, Middle Ground Book Fest. My name is Jake Burt. I also write novels for middle grade readers. My upcoming novel, The Ghoul of Windy Down Vale, is my first truly spooky book, and I don't have a copy of it because it's not out yet. It comes out in September, but I do have the cover art right there. That's what it looks like, appropriately spooky there. The monster featured on the cover there is the ghoul. That also happens to be the main character of the novel. He's a 14-year-old boy named Copper Innskeep, who dresses up like a vicious, monstrous ghoul and goes out into the swampland surrounding his hometown in order to try to scare people away from those swamps, to keep them from sinking down and dying. The book is filled with monsters, filled with murder, and a whole lot of mayhem. I'll pass it on over to Kate.
Forgot I was muted. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, and it's so good to see my fellow panelists here. I'm so excited to talk about spooky stories with you. I write books for middle grade and upper middle grade, and they are set in a world that is kind of like ours, but with the weird and uncanny elements kind of dialed up to 11. So if you think of all of the strange and unexplained things that happen in our everyday lives, the little weird, odd, unexplainables, if they actually had kind of a supernatural explanation. And if you have read any of my books, you might know Green Glass House, and that is set in a city called Nagspeak, which is a very oddball city in which strange things really do happen. My current book is the Raconteur's Commonplace book, which is a collection of folk tales from the city of Nagspeak with a framing mystery tying it all together. And my preferred spooky when I write is kind of just really looking at the uncanny, the strange and unsettling, and sometimes those things tend to be very normal feeling things, the kinds of like things that give us like the weird feels even in the real world, and then just dialing them up. And I will pass it on to Eden.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, everybody on the panel, and thank you, Middle Ground Book Fest. This is my debut novel, Root Magic. Let's see if I can fit it in here appropriately. It is a Southern Gothic middle grade, meaning that it is set in the American South, most specifically an island named Wadmalaw Island, which is a real island where one of my grandparents grew up. It has a lot of historical value because there are lots of stories from my ancestors that I have included in this book. There's also lots of sort of tough and difficult situations like racism, bullying, a lot of difficult topics that are very scary and frightening to experience, as well to even sometimes read about and discuss. But it's mixed up with a lot of magic that's real. Some of it I've fictionalized just a touch to make it super over the top, but it really is a story of love, friendship, family, and ancestry, and using all of those things in order to combat the difficult situations that you face every day. And I will turn it over to Supriya.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Supriya Kelkar, and I am the author of middle grade books and picture books. And I have some spooky elements in my historical fiction, Strong as Fire, Fierce as Flame, which came out earlier this year. This is the story of a child bride who, in 1857 in India, who runs away from the life she has no say in, only to end up a servant in the house of a British officer in the British East India Company. And she has to overcome her fears and join the rebellion when it comes to town. But my spookiest book comes out next year. It's called The Cobra Song, and it is the story of a 10-year-old girl in Michigan who comes from a long line of classical Hindustani singers, which is a type of singing from India. And one day a mysterious stranger comes into town, and she is convinced her neighbor has turned into an Ichadari Nagin, which is a cobra that can turn into a human. And she has to get over her fears and harness the power of her song and her voice in order to stop this evil cobra human from turning her entire town into a kingdom of snakes. So that is either next year or the year after. I'm not positive yet, but I will turn it over to Max.
Thank you. I am Max Brallier, and I write some different sort of spooky, scary, action, scary stuff. Eerie Elementary, the Mr. Shiver series, and the Last Kids on Earth series. And I also don't have a cover, like an actual physical copy yet of the new book. I went to print yesterday, but there's the sort of cover, Last Kids on Earth, and the Doomsday Race. Yeah, and right now working on the next Last Kids on Earth book, and also the next Mr. Shivers book, and I'm totally blanking on ideas for spooky short stories. So if anybody has any, I welcome them.
Excellent. So many amazing stories. And if you hear the hound of the Baskervilles in the background, don't worry. It's just like an added touch to our spooky show here. But let's talk about horror, and why does horror appeal to so many readers, especially young readers? And to kick it off, I'm going to send it over to Jake.
Thank you, Kim. So I'm a fifth grade teacher in addition to being an author of middle grade fiction. And so I'm in this kind of unique position where I get to recommend books to my students in addition to writing them myself. And when my students come to me and ask for a book recommendation, they don't often talk about the plot of a book. They don't necessarily come up and say, hey, Mr. Burt, do you have a book about a 14-year-old boy who lives in a swamp-infested city and has to dress up like a monster in order to scare people? Do you got one of those books? They don't do that. They don't even really come to me and ask for books based on genre. They don't even say, do you have a science fiction novel? Or do you have a contemporary, realistic middle grade novel for me, Mr. Burt? No, what they do is they come and they say, Mr. Burt, do you got a funny book? Mr. Burt, do you have a scary book? Mr. Burt, do you have a book that's going to make me cry? I'm interested in a sad book. When kids are asking for recommendations for books, they go right to the emotion, the way the book makes them feel. And I think if we're honest with ourselves about readers, at least for me as an adult, that's why I read books too, because ultimately I want that book to evoke an emotion. I want to feel something as I'm reading that. And I think scary stories, spooky stories, stories that are uncanny, as Kate was saying, these are brilliant at making you feel something. That fear, that unease, that tension that you feel throughout a horror novel, that horror does such a wonderful job of building and building and building until you get this spectacular climax, which in middle grade often resolves in a more peaceable or kindly or settling way than adult horror. I think that's why people gravitate toward horror, because it's brilliant. It's one of the best genres at making you feel something.
I love that. And I love back to what Kate was saying with this uncanny world, this idea of horror lending a magical quality to an otherwise troubled world. And if you are a child who is going through a lot of stress and trouble that you don't have the ability to tackle, well, guess what? Within the pages of a horror book, there's a monster that can be defeated. So you get to kind of have that cathartic experience. I think that's part of what drew me to horror, like the scary stories to tell in the dark with all of those horrific images that I adored so much when I was a kid. But who else would like to chime in? I send it over to Kate.
I always think when we talk about like the feelings of horror and why people like it, there's two things. And one is, and I wish I'd thought to have it with me, is one of the stories in the Frog and Toad books, which we all, I'm sure, like know to some degree, but for anyone who's watching who doesn't, like they're these very early chapter books. Like I read them to my kids as soon as they were old enough to sit for, a couple sentences more before we turn the page. They're very, very early chapter books. And one of them is called The Shivers, one of the chapters within. It's just this little short story and it's called The Shivers. And in it, Frog says to Toad, like, do you like to feel scared? Do you like to feel the shivers? And Toad, who is much more nervous than Frog, always like, no, I don't. And then Frog starts telling this shivery story, and the two of them just sit there in front of the fire as he tells this story. And it just ends with something like, and they both felt the shivers, and they both felt good. Like it was a feeling that both gave them like a scare and something to be worried about, but also it was a good feeling. Like there is something about that that's cathartic, but also the act of reading a scary book when you're curled up by the fire, when you're safe at home, when you can contrast the feelings that you're reading about to the feelings that you're looking for in actual life, and you can step back out of it at the end. I always think of that Frog and Toad story. And the other thing is that it used to be traditional to tell scary stories at the holidays. And I think that's also a similar thing. Like when we're surrounded by, coziness, there is also this part of us that's like, but what if there's something lurking out there? There's something about sharing scary stories that is really special. Not just reading them too, but sharing them. And I think that's one of the things that appeals to me writing them, is like being able to share something that, hopefully will evoke that feeling. But there's an emotional thing to just reading those, even beyond the scare, that I think gives us something really important.
Absolutely. And let's head over to Max. Did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. First of all, I didn't know until last year that Frog and Toad and Wind in the Willows were not the same thing. And I'm really embarrassed by that. But I remember like seeing the art and as a kid and always thinking like, oh, like in my head, those are the same thing. Anyways. So I think I was thinking about this a lot because I listen to I work like late at night often, and I'll take like a 10-minute break to like do the dishes or whatever, and I listen to like an audiobook, and I'm listening to a lot of scary stuff, and like I was listening to something that was really terrifying me and like freaking me out. I kept seeing my reflection in the window, and it was like I was like, why am I doing this? Like this is like I was very, very scared, and I didn't have an answer for it. I don't know why really, but like it made my heart pound in a way that like a roller coaster does or something. And I seek that out for some reason. This was to the point where I turned it off while I was like in my house alone at night, because it was a Stephen King short story that really got to me. But I think also like for me, like I'm a sort of anxious person, and I don't know, I find the world sort of scary sometimes, and there's that like I like the feeling of having, and I hate the feeling of having nightmares. I like the feeling of waking up from them, and there's that like split second where like, oh no, it's like it's true, that's all true, then it's like, oh wait, no, it's not, like that's okay, everything's okay. And I love that feeling of being like, it's okay. I like to read about like scary. I don't read like a lot of like beach reads or cozy mysteries, because everybody in those is like, except for the dead ones, are usually like sort of happy. And I don't want to read about people who are like doing fantastic and really happy, because like I want to read about people who are like terrified and things are scary, because then I feel a little bit better about my life. So I think that's why.
I love that, except for the dead ones. I think cozy mysteries actually kind of really fit into this, like what Kate was saying, because you have that wonderful cozy feel that you want to sink into, but then there's like 5 dead bodies in this really small, quaint English village where that would never happen.
Yeah.
And I love that idea of like, it's midwinter and you don't have electricity, you're around the fire and you're telling stories to kind of defeat the monsters in a way. Eden, is that how you think of horror stories? Like as a way to kind of overcome monsters, or is there a different appeal?
I think there's a different appeal for different people. I think people come to horror for different reasons. Sometimes it is that I want to conquer an existing fear that I have, and this is a controllable way of doing it. You can always turn the movie off or shut the book or put it in the freezer, or whatever you have to do to make yourself feel comfortable again. But I think there are other people that just enjoy that feeling of, as Kate says, the shivers. It's an excitement sort of thing. It's almost like the same feeling that you would get, I don't know, being on a roller coaster or doing a bungee jump. There's this anticipation that builds, and then there's finally the thing that happens. And there's this plummet or there's this free fall that's thrilling, that's harder to get with other genres of books. And I think that people come to horror for different reasons, but they all get that sort of satisfaction of a controllable excitement that lingers with you long after you close the book.
I love it. Supriya, is it the shivers for you? Is that why you've started adding in some of these scary elements?
I love the thrill. I'm a very fearful person. I think I've always been a really scared kid. I remember I had to write this nonfiction project about sharks, and I drew these sharks that were so realistic for a 9-year-old, I thought, that I was terrified every day when I had to get into the shower that a shark was going to come out of the drain, even though I knew that a shark couldn't get into my shower drain in Michigan. I was still like terrified for like weeks. I did shower every day. I was just really scared. But I, and even as an adult, like Max was saying, when I'm home alone or it's late at night and I hear noises, I'm like, oh, that's a ghost. That has to be a ghost. I like immediately go there. So I think for kids who are like me, what I really loved about reading spooky stories is, like Eden was saying, it's controllable. If it gets too scary, you can shut the book. But I also like to see kids being able to conquer their fears and getting to the other side of it, and knowing that, when I was that age, that, oh, I can also do this. I can get over these fears and, find some form of bravery or resolution to whatever I'm going through.
Yes, I love it. So we have the shivers, the fantasy, especially in middle grade. Often the horror has some paranormal or supernatural element about it. But as we've kind of touched on, it can also start discussions about real life issues. So let's talk about that. Like, how can horror start these deeper reflections on real life issues that kids might be going through? So I'm going to send that one over to Eden first.
I think that horror gives people the chance to experience the world through the eyes of people that are not like themselves. And that is always a way to help practice empathy. You get to experience a story through someone that's from a different part of the world, or from a different cultural background, or from a different ability background. So it allows you to empathize with that character, and hopefully, and in a larger whole, begin to empathize more with people not like yourself. And it's also a way to give people an opening to discuss different topics, because in Root Magic especially, it's set in 1963 in the American South, where racism is rampant, and this book gives people a chance to have discussions that might be challenging to broach otherwise. And it's sometimes difficult to begin a discussion about something that's still such a fraught topic in 2021. So how do you bring this up with people? How do you approach it? And having a book that presents these topics and presents these ideas and situations allows you to have that jumping off point to start discussions about more difficult things, and hopefully open up more of a back and forth conversation about it, and allow people who have certain emotions and history and background, to share their stories with people that are newer to finding out a lot of these situations and matters that have happened in real life. I think about something like, say, the Tulsa Race Massacre, which wasn't taught in schools, even in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where it happened, because of a show, Watchmen, focusing on that topic and showing it. There was a discussion opened up. Is this something we should start teaching? Is this something that we should bring to the fore and let people know about? And now that is a part of American history that is taught that wasn't really ever brought to the forefront before.
That's so true. And there's this way that by adding that layer of fantasy, it renders a very difficult topic somehow safer to discuss. And I know, like, my first book I ever wrote was in 6th grade, and it was an assignment for school. We had to illustrate our own picture book, and mine was called The Wednesday Morning Club with a U, and it was all about these 5 adults who lose a loved one, and they form a club to talk about their grief. And I was so desperate to find things that helped me understand this topic that was too scary that I couldn't broach it. And so I think that's partly why I was drawn to things like scary stories to tell in the dark, because I wanted to find a way to understand death that was not like so horrifying and scary as it would be like in real life. So adding that layer of fantasy to do that, or like in Skeleton Tree, like death is represented in the guise of this juggling skeleton that's more afraid of the main character than he is of it, etc. So a lot of my stories are kind of explorations of things that I am scared of in the real world, and adding those layers of fantasy to help me understand those things in a way that is somehow less scary. But who would like to add on to that? I see Kate.
I think there's you guys really hit on the nail on the head. And some like this, all horror, I think, begins, at least the things that are recognizable, passed on through the centuries, folklore. Like it kind of all begins as a metaphor or a way of explaining something that people had to explain away. And you look at all of the lore behind vampires and all of the lore behind werewolves and these things that have incarnations around the world in multiple cultures in some variety or another. And the reason those things exist over and over again is that they address these fears that we all have on some level, and these ways of looking at death and mortality and life and all of these really complex questions. And so we do have these pieces of folklore that persist and grow and continue to take different shape as different people use them as a metaphor to tackle these big ideas. And so for a lot of kids, when they're reading these things, like, they're not coming into it with like centuries of research on the lore of vampires and what it represented in this culture or that culture and what those big questions were. They're coming into it because it's something that is that's real to them, or that is a fear that they like to, or thing that they like to think about. But it does and can become a vessel for continuing to talk about these big issues. And I couldn't put it any better than Eden did. Like this can be a thing that we draw kids in because these scary stories are cool, but that they still push those buttons about those universal fears and those struggles that we still need to talk about. And so I think they can be both like the wonderful shivery things, but yeah. And I don't want to restate, because Eden, you said it so beautifully. I think that that's really an important point, that you can come for the shivers and stay for the big conversations.
I love that. And Jake, I know this relates to your book that's coming up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kate is right that the monster is almost always a metaphor. Godzilla is a metaphor for nuclear proliferation and the dangers inherent therein, the fears that humanity has, that we are going beyond the scope of what we should be with science, and the outcome is Godzilla, who comes to teach us our lesson, right? But there's also, that not 0% chance that something monster adjacent might happen in your life. I'm very proud to say that we live right now at a time where not only society, but children in society are more prepared now for the zombie apocalypse than they have been at any point in human history, simply because of children's literature and other media that have taught our kids how to survive a zombie apocalypse. Max can speak a little bit to this because he's got a little bit of post-apocalyptic end of the world stuff going on in his graphic novels. But in terms of like the Ghoul of Windy Down Vale, my monster is absolutely a metaphor, and it touches on real life issues of where do I belong in the world? How do I straddle the line between my responsibilities to who I am and how scary that is as a 14-year-old kid? What are my responsibilities to the broader community? How do I help these people, but at the same time, still be a kid? And this monster is a metaphor for those fears about whether or not my main character, Copper, is doing that right, whether or not he's doing a service and honor to his family and his community, while at the same time trying to just be Copper, the kid.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and so Max, you have books that are often like lighter and humorous. Would you say that you're still kind of tackling some of those deeper issues or opening discussions to things like that? I mean, of course, preparing for the zombie apocalypse, that's important, right?
Extremely important. I think that the deeper issues that I tackle in the last Kids on Earth series are more about something that I like that I sort of stumbled into in writing it, but has become very important, and that's sort of the idea of like finding your like a found family and finding your place, and like the extraordinary situation sort of causing someone to like rise to the moment, but not in like necessarily always a huge brave heroic way, but in like by doing it sort of with the help of like when scared, when terrified, with the help of like those closest to you. Those are the moments in the book series where when I feel like they work, they don't always work. When I feel like they work, that I'm sort of most proud of, like where it's like that you sort of get emotional writing it like every once in a while. And so that's sort of what I've found when writing Last Kids, and then when doing like other like the Mr. Shiver series, which is like those are young, but they're pretty dark, and like they're very much inspired by scary stories to tell in the dark, where like there's a lot of not happy endings in them, which some reviewers have not liked because it's for first and second grade. But I like it. And I think that there's a sort of the deeper reflection is sometimes like, don't leave your toys in the backyard at night when it rains, because then they'll come inside and they will march into your room and shut the door behind you, and that's the end of the story. So I think that there's like a sort of like a moral, like the best fables, like a little bit of a moral to a lot of them. The Harold story and scary stories to tell in the dark, whenever about the scarecrow that comes to life, is still like the most terrifying thing that I've ever read, and it scared me into never. If I'm ever alone in the room with any sort of inanimate human-sized thing, I'm not mean to it because of Harold.
Well, yeah, I think, and that is such a good point. I think we're going to touch on this a little bit later, that there can be a big difference between like full-length, novel-length, middle grade horror and what the expectations are, and short stories. You can get away with a lot of tragic endings in short stories, which I love. But I'm going to turn it over to Supriya, and if you have anything to add about like deeper reflections. But also, I want to bring up our next question, which is that although we've already talked about like all of the deeper places you can go with horror, a lot of adults will just see like horror and all they've seen are like slasher movies and blood and guts, and they're like, why would we ever want kids to read this? There's no literary value to stories like this. So what would you say to adults who have that impression of horror?
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about this for the previous question as well, because I think, you know, unlike adult slasher movies, which are generally just there for the thrills, in middle grade, we're able to tackle so many deeper issues for children through the device of horror. Like Eden was saying in the Cobra Song, I'm able to look at the casual racism and microaggressions that have made my main character's voice be stifled. And, you know, hopefully it's a book that really empowers readers to find their voice in whatever form it may take and know just how important it is and how you can change your world with it. So I think in middle grade, you know, gatekeepers are always going to find issues with certain genres. I know we see a lot of backlash for graphic novels and for horror, but we all know just how much there is in these beautiful genres and how much we can explore with using those as devices to go deeper into really serious issues or really important issues that can empower children.
I love that. Yeah. And I think there's also, you know, there are novels that are appreciated for their literary merit and their beautiful style. And there are novels that are equally as valuable that are mostly escapist. And it's mostly about you're losing yourself in that world. And I think that can be such an important thing, especially if you have readers who are dealing with things in real life, whether it's like mental health issues or stressors that are going on in real life. Like this book that is like purely an escapist, like amazing thrill ride, for example, or just like so funny, that can provide such a valuable service in that reader's life, just allowing them to escape that for a moment. So I think there are different types of literary value that we can talk about too. But who would like to kind of add on to this conversation? Jake, I see. Yes. Raise your skeleton hand if you want to add, Jake.
I think my own hands are bony enough to qualify. Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what both Supriya and Kim just said. There are some things that horror as a genre demands of the author that I think are incredibly literary. One of them is pacing. The pacing of a horror novel has to be exquisite if it's going to be good horror. There's plenty of bad horror out there in every sort of media and every sort of format. But for middle grade, we do have this additional level of, as Supriya said, gatekeepers, people who will, check out our horror before it makes it into the hands of our audience, whether it's our agents or editors or librarians or teachers, whoever is filtering that stuff. By definition, if those gatekeepers are doing their jobs, then the horror that makes it to kids is going to be good horror. So the pacing is going to be excellent. And if you want an example of a well-paced novel, look to the horror novels who have an obligation to build tension in kind of the ideal way, similar to the way that horror needs to do description incredibly well. A teacher would be well served using a horror novel in their classroom if the skill they're trying to build is inferencing, reading between the lines. Horror novelists have to put lots of their text between the lines so they're not spoiling the mystery or decreasing the tension in the novel as they lead up ultimately to the climax. And also, if you're looking for the literary impact of horror, just take a listen to this panel and the number of us who were affected catastrophically by scary stories to tell in the dark. I too have behaviors that have changed for me as an adult as a result of reading scary stories to tell in the dark. I will not sleep in a bed on the first floor of a building if that bed is adjacent to a window. I won't. Like if I could pull back the shade and have the face of something be right there next to my bed, I will not sleep in that bed. And that is a direct result of Stephen Gemmel's illustrations in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
I love it. And I just thought they were so gorgeous. I was like, oh, I'm in awe of these gorgeous illustrations. But who would like to add onto the literary merit discussion?
I'll jump in real quick. That I think two things. One is I think the question, like the literary merit of anything that's getting a kid to read, is really silly and criminal. And it can, I think, sort of what you were saying earlier is very much the reason that I write. I guess I don't know. I would classify horror a little bit as sort of like genre escapist fiction, even though it's a sort of a less of a yay escape it, but it's not, you know, realistic necessarily. And that, like, that for me, like, I write, I think the value in, if there's any value in the books that I write, I think it's that, like, it provides an escape, like, for a kid who has had a bad day or a bad week or a bad 4 years. Like when I would have lousy days at school, I was a really shy kid. I moved a lot. I was an anxious kid. Like, I would come home and I would read and I would watch movies that were always sort of scary or adventure packed, and would let me sort of go to a different place and forget about, like, what was going on at school or whatever for like 2 hours. And that was like the most valuable thing that could be offered to me. And I think that's what, particularly Last Kids, because Last Kids is like full of monsters and zombies, but it's really like an adventure. It's like really like an action adventure at its heart. That, I don't know, that's just incredibly valuable, and far more valuable than I think other things that maybe be, you know, other more acclaimed works. I think letting a kid feel good for 2 hours is the most thing. So that's my thoughts.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, like, the other thing that adults often will say when they think about, like, kids reading horror is, but it's going to give them nightmares. We can't allow the kids to read the scary stories. So let's bring it to that question. Kate, what would you say to adults who are afraid of giving kids nightmares?
I feel like if you write anything that's spooky, you hear that so often. It's somebody think of the children. So I actually have a story in Raconteur's Commonplace book where there's 15 people. They're stuck in this inn. They're flooded in, and they're telling stories to pass the time. And for various reasons, several of the tellers early on are telling dark stories, like they're stories that have, you know, ambiguous endings or where creepy things happen. And there's one child in the group, and one of the innkeepers is this very well-intentioned, like, everybody's aunt, and she says, like, everyone's telling all these scary stories, like, and she's basically like nodding at the child who's playing on the floor, and he's like, I'm going to tell a story for you, and don't worry, there's nothing unpleasant in it. It's just like, it's all, and she starts off telling this story about, like, she plugs the girl in as a princess in this land that she starts off saying it's full of lollipops and unicorns, and the girl just is getting visibly bored in front of her. So she starts changing the story, and it becomes darker as she's responding to, like, what this kid is responding to. And finally, there is an option where the story could branch, and it could go very, very dark, or the lady can try and veer it back toward the light. And the girl speaks up, and she's like, I want the character to meet the character where this is going to go dark. And the innkeeper says to her, I wonder at you, Maisie, you'll have nightmares. And there's this pause, and she says, oh, you have them already. All right, fine. And then from that point on, she doesn't look back. She leans right into, like, every dark decision she could make. There's monsters. There's an attempted murder on this girl's life. And there's a point where she says, and Maisie knew that she was never again going to be a girl that no one had tried to kill. And the girl comes out of it she finishes the story, and it's the happiest the little girl has been. Like, she's been in a story, she's had this ridiculous adventure, and all of these things that she hasn't told anyone she's scared of, this character version of her got to overcome. And so it was sort of like, as much as I could sort of respond to that thing in, like, a short story, like, maybe they have nightmares already. Maybe this is how you figure out how to combat those nightmares. Maybe this is just how you get the feelings to work. You have a chance to work through those feelings without having to experience it. I think that, you know, we've touched on a lot of the good that scary stories can do. And so much of it comes down to it is a way to feel your way through things that you are afraid that you're going to have to experience, or that you are experiencing in a metaphorical sense. You feel your way through it. You can think your way through it. You can see a way to come out the other end. And, you know, not to state the obvious, but you can also shut the book and walk away. Who said about putting it in the freezer? I think that's amazing. Like, you don't kids are really good, I think, at deciding when a story isn't for them. And so that's also a perfectly valid thing. I think kids are able to shut the book and walk away too. But if they don't, it's because there's something in it that is speaking to them and letting them think through ideas that maybe they didn't have a way to do without those metaphors and without those higher stakes. And also sometimes to show them that the things that they're worried about actually don't have stakes this high. And horror can have that value too, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that freezer idea. So I want to send it over to Eden. And what would you say to this idea of horror giving kids nightmares?
I think that Kate is right on the money, where kids have these existing fears already, whether they voice them to their parents or not. But I think that a lot of older horror stories are based in folklore. A lot of root magic is based in Gullah Geechee folklore, which is the group of people that I'm descended from. And a lot of those tales that I grew up with were cautionary tales. Again, it goes back to when people have difficulty sort of approaching a subject. How do you discuss with your kids something that may or may not be happening to them without trying to give them worries about, well, could that happen to me? You wrap it up in a story, and kids will take away from that story that you've told them what applies to their life. And like Jake said, because of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, he has made a life decision of something that he will never do again. And that's where a lot of those folkloric tales that were the basis for root magic came from. They were cautionary tales that family and friends would tell to kids to make sure that you don't go in the swamp at night, or make sure that you don't hang out with that particular person because of a history or something that's happened in their past. So it's, again, that way of sort of opening conversation and giving instruction and helping people to lead a better, safer life.
Yes. And I love that idea too, that kids will take away from a story what they're ready for at that moment. And this idea too, that it's like, it's all about choice, you know, like letting kids read the books that they are drawn to. I know, Max, you were touching on that. So I want to get to kind of our final question, which we've already mentioned a little bit, that middle grade horror is also very different from horror that is written for other audiences, and also like those horror films that people might be familiar with. So let's talk about some of those differences. What makes middle grade horror unique?
I don't have a good answer to that, to be honest. I think that besides the obvious stuff like the language used, the construction of the sentences and things like that, and maybe the age of the protagonists or the antagonists, or you know, in an older horror novel, the witch is 650 years old, but for middle grade, the witches are like 400 years old. But I don't really know beyond that. I think the things that scare us change as we get older, and sometimes, not always. Like, I'm still scared of sharks, and still scared of sharks in when I'm swimming in a pool, because when I kick your feet and your head's underwater, it sounds like the Jaws theme. And so I think that it can get very blurry, especially as it's out with I lose track of how to define books by age group, but like as you get to like upper middle grade or white, like there's not much difference between that and like and something like for adults. And I've not read many books that are scarier as an adult than Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was, and that's it.
Yeah.
So I don't really know. So I think what comes down to the difference is probably a little bit shorter, and there's much more restrictions put on, or sort of if you know, there are gatekeepers again trying to say no, whereas I've never encountered that when buying a horror novel as an adult.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we touched on it a little bit, like in adult horror, you tend to have this lingering sense of dread. Like even if you defeat the monster, nothing is ever okay. But with middle grade, you always end in a hopeful place, except for short stories, which we kind of mentioned. Like you can have that tragic ending, but with the novels, you're generally going to focus on hope. So I know we are basically out of time, but in our last 30 seconds, I want to give Supriya and Jake a final word on middle grade horror. So what makes it unique and what do we love about middle grade horror? Send it over to Supriya.
I think everyone has said it so well. There's so much to explore in middle grade horror. There are deeper issues being talked about. There is comfort, there are thrills, and I think the fear level is appropriate for our audience. We're not, murdering anyone in a very gory way. So I think it's a great way to work through your fears and feel empowered. Jake, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'd just say again from the teacher perspective, for every kid who you think is not ready for a middle grade horror novel, there are kids who are desperate for them and who need those kinds of stories because of the visceral impact of them. That's the way that kid is going to get involved in reading. That's the way you're going to get that kid to keep reading. So horror, I would say, definitely serves a vital function in middle grade literature.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us to discuss the scary things today, and check down in the description for a link to RJ Julia, the partner bookstore for Middle Ground Book Fest. And hope you all have an amazing, not too terrifying day. Thanks, everyone. Wave with my skeleton hand.